Welcome to Education Joining the Dots, our podcast covering all things assessment and practice. We are, of course, GL Assessment, or GL Education, depending on where you are in the world. A Renaissance company providing formative, standardized assessments in the UK and Ireland and over 100 countries worldwide. I'm Ryan Hughes, International Education Advisor at GL Education. In this role, I work with school groups around the world to help them optimize use of their assessment products and utilize their data to accelerate student learning. Wherever you are in the world, please reach out if you'd like to speak with our Education Advisor team about how to use your school data and move the needle on student attainment. I'm a former teacher with 18 years of experience in the UK independent and state sectors. When I worked in the classroom, I was passionate about using data to inform interventions, looking for trends across my practice materials, and focusing future instruction to fit the needs of my students. A major challenge in the ed tech sector today is how to bring a school's data all together in one place so that teachers can act upon it easily. That is precisely what we are working to achieve. An integrated learning ecosystem where assessment, practice, and insights all live in one place. I'm truly excited to see what the next 5 years will bring and the difference this will make for teachers and learners. Be sure to watch this space. The focus of this episode is the value of standardized assessments. We're kicking off with our Data Spotlight Explainer, designed to demystify data and assessment terminology. So now I'll hand over to Georgina and Rachel to explain proximal and distal assessments.
Our data spotlight today is about proximal and distal assessments. Unknown language to many, myself included, until really recently when I was having a conversation with Georgina. So, Georgina, in layman's terms, could you help to explain what a proximal and distal assessment is?
Yeah, hi Rachel. So a proximal assessment is basically an assessment that is designed to measure a certain set of criteria. It's proximal because it's close to the teaching content. That's how I always remember it. So for an example, you may be teaching a unit or an intervention of vocabulary for a certain group of students, and you need to know what vocabulary they know and what they don't. So you do a proximal assessment at the beginning of that intervention. You test the children on the selection of words at the beginning, and then you teach them that intervention that's based on those words you know that they need to know, and then you reassess them at the end of that unit and you see the progress they've made. And then a distal assessment is one that has distance basically to the knowledge and skills that you are teaching. The assessment is not necessarily linked to the teaching unit or the intervention. And these distal assessments are really crucial as well because they can show you whether a student has retained and can apply their knowledge in a different context. It allows you to compare attainment against a national sample, for example, and it will also allow you to see progress over time. So it can be really useful, not only to baseline, but also to understand whether a student has retained knowledge. And as an example of that, our new group reading test or our progress test in English could be used as a distal assessment because they're not directly linked to what you're teaching students, but they are really useful to show you whether a student is progressing in line with their age expectation. And I often speak to schools that use NGRT or PTE, for example, and they ask me things like, well, how do I prepare students for this assessment? How do we teach to make sure they're doing really well? And why are we not seeing progress a bit quicker? And I always say back to them, it's really important that you actually understand that this distal assessment is designed to do something very different to a proximal assessment. So it may take a bit more time to show progress in a distal assessment because your teaching content won't directly link to the assessment, and we're not meant to prepare students for that assessment. They are meant to be there to drop in, to check in on where students are. So I'd go back to research because I know that this is always something that lands quite well. We've all heard of Ebbinghaus' forgetting curve. And Rach, you and I talked the other day about how easy it is to forget. It's very hard to keep things in our memory. And I think that we've all in school been very aware of that when we teach students. We know that's why things like interleaving have been so popular, because in order for pupils to retain knowledge, they have got to practice over and over again and be reminded of that knowledge over and over again for it to really be secure in their memory. So when you're considering when to use a distal or a proximal assessment, the answer is You need both of those because you need to have that really crucial balancing act of celebrating the success that you might have with a group of students. So showing the impact of teaching those words, for example, in that intervention. And yes, we've got it, guys. This is what you did at the beginning and this is how you've done at the end. So look at the progress we've made. But you also need to have an assessment that shows you the generalization of knowledge. So knowledge that's built over time. So can they use those words, for example, in a piece of writing in 10 weeks' time or in 2 terms' time? And that's where those distal assessments are really crucial as well.
Brilliant. And I couldn't agree with you more. And once the proximal and distal was explained to me in that way, it just made so many different pieces of the assessment puzzle fit into place. And as it happens, the team I work within, the Assessment Insights team, we meet with schools to talk about their data. And I met with a school just yesterday and we had that exact conversation. They wanted to talk about, how can I plan all my assessments into the academic year so that they have the biggest impact and hopefully bring about the best learning for the students. So having all that in mind, how would you suggest a school plan assessment for the greatest impact?
That's a really good question, and it is something that we talk about with schools all the time. And I know when I was in school leading assessment and managing a budget, I had a real responsibility to make sure that I managed my resources and my budget really well. And there's lots of us in schools that have that responsibility. We need to make sure we use the time with our students in the best possible way to have the most impact with them. So I do think it's really important to just take a step back and don't always done what you've ever done that you've done before, because it's in your assessment cycle, and that's just how we do this here. Really think about your context. We talk about context being king, and it really is. Your students, your school, what's best for that school and that group of students. So think about context. What's your role and what are you looking to assess? What kind of assessments do you have? What variety of assessments do you have? We've talked about proximal and distal, but how many of your assessments are high stakes? How many are low stakes? Which ones are formal? Which ones are informal? Are we giving students enough chance to succeed? Do we give them enough time between assessment points to show impact? Do we make sure we give enough time to them to give them formative feedback so that we can really support that progress? It's crucial that they understand what they need to do and what their next step is. That's always got to be something you can talk to students about. They need to own that as much as we do. We know how important it is for learning to be personalised, and it can't possibly be if we're not giving them regular feedback. So really think about what kind of assessments you do and also how you time them. And the third thing really, so I've talked about them being really kind of clear. What do we do and why? How does your timing work? And the third kind of top tip is no one size fits all. And we really need to support pupils to show off in their learning, I think. And thinking about that, what is the motivational or the emotional impact of the assessment planning that you have? How have you considered the demographics of the students you've got in your school? So my third kind of point would be flexible with your assessment, because not all students need the same assessment cycle or the same assessment plan as anyone else.
I couldn't agree with you more. And thank you so much for explaining that so succinctly. Thanks, Georgina.
Thank you.
Now, I'm delighted to be speaking with somebody equally enthusiastic about using data in schools. Becky St is a school assessment and performance data specialist. She is passionate about helping schools and multi-academy trusts use data effectively to improve outcomes. Becky, it's really lovely to have you here today. Can you please give us a bit of background and introduce yourself?
Hello, Ryan. It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. So I am a freelance school assessment and performance data consultant, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I try and get everything that I do into one. I started off 15 years ago as a data manager in a large secondary school. And I was a very enthusiastic user of our tracking system, which was Sistra at the time. So eventually they offered me a job, moved to working in training for Sistra, eventually became head of training, and then decided to take the leap into the unknown. And so for the last 7 years, I've been freelance. So I've worked with a lot of different companies, a lot of different schools. I support with data management, data analysis, data strategy. And a while back, I did work in the training team for GL assessment. That was pre-COVID, and I spent a lot of time on the road visiting schools on behalf of GL assessment, training up teachers, administrators, every part of the school team who are going to be using it. Basically, my main aim in life is to ensure that schools of all types and trusts are able to use data to improve outcomes. And I also work with schools to reduce the associated workload, which is a bit of a buzzword at the moment.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm really excited to listen and to learn from your wealth of experience. So let's just get straight into it. The burning question for me is the value of standardized assessments. Let's say that I'm a large multi-academy trust and I've got a big team with lots of experience creating and running assessments. Why should my schools use standardized assessments like GL's progress test series rather than just generating a non-standardized model that I could build in-house?
I think the concept of the trust is actually a particularly interesting one, but even within schools, the problems with an internally designed test is one internally designed test could be intrinsically harder or easier than another one through no fault of the teachers setting it. And they're not really particularly good for comparing the performance of different students on the same tests, different tests across time, tests between schools, or across subjects, because it can lead to different levels of results for a student for different students, let's say, with actually the same level of learning, or at different points in time for a student with the same level of learning. Where standardized tests have a big strength is that what you get from them initially is a raw score, but that score is put onto a scale. It's put onto sort of a standard distribution. And so what you're looking at is a position on the scale. And that position on a scale means that what you're doing is comparing your student to other students nationally. And that place on a scale is really easily compared across time, across subjects, across schools. It basically gives a really even playing field.
Okay, I want to be the real devil's advocate here. And so I'm saying, okay, so you've put my students onto a scale. You're telling me that I can compare them nationally, but what I'm interested in as a trust lead or as an individual classroom teacher, I'm interested in that student making progress. So how is it that the standardized assessment gives me that in a way that I couldn't just measure as the teacher of that student?
So because it's a position on a scale, every time a student takes a test, so let's say we're looking at an individual and they're taking a test in English or maths on a regular basis, what you're expecting from that student is that they would get the same score each time. They'd be in the same place on that scale. If they get a score that is higher, it's obvious that they have progressed faster than you would expect. If their score is lower than the one before, it shows that they have progressed more slowly. If you are using internally designed tests, that second test may be harder or easier than the first one. So you can't really tell if they have progressed or not because of that inherent slight danger that the tests are not equal. But this is where I really, really like the GL assessment approach, because what GL assessment does is use a standardized age score, not just a standardized score. So what this means is that the results from the test trials are used to calculate averages for pupils of a certain age in years and months, not just for a whole year group or a whole cohort, which means that every time the student takes a test, they're being compared with pupils nationally of their own age in years and months. So you know that if they have had a change in score between one test and another, it's not just because they've got older and they've learned more on that year's curriculum. It's because they have actually made progress, and it's how they're doing compared to people of other students of their own age. If you think about sort of younger pupils particularly, we have a huge range of attainment between pupils who are autumn born and who are summer born. I mean, especially if you take gender into account, your summer born boys compared to your autumn born girls, there's a big gap. So I think it's really good that GL assessment actually used that age standardized score instead of just taking that pupil and comparing them to everybody within a year group.
Yeah. And it sounds as well as that what we're doing by having that standardized assessment is removing some of the bias, removing maybe if it's harder or easier. So even if it's not a bespoke assessment that we've created within a school, what you're saying is the statistical robustness of the process is giving us advantages that we would never have.
Exactly. So even if the test is harder or easier, because the result is then put onto a scale, a national scale, it still gives you that really accurate, comparable data. They haven't got a lower score or a higher score because the test is harder or easier.
Okay, I see. That's really great. Well, let's consider a teaching environment where standardized assessments are being mandated by the senior team. Why might teachers be resistant to this? And how would you encourage teachers to react?
Yeah, this is something I came across a lot when I was working for GL assessment. I'd go into a school and be faced with a hall of 100 teachers who didn't want it, didn't like it, weren't happy about it. They'd been told they'd got to do it by their senior team. And they would, they would challenge me. Well, why should we use this? What's wrong with my judgment? They would sometimes feel that their judgment wasn't trusted. They felt that maybe the senior team were bringing in the tests to replace their judgment. And so, there was a lot of hostility to the introduction of the tests. Got to say, it gets even worse when the tests are purchased or subscribed to by a trust team, because then even the senior staff in some of the schools may not be very keen. So at that point, it was my job to kind of, win hearts and minds over. And I think that the approach that I would take, and it's not just an approach, it is what I truly believe, is that the standardized test results are there to support the teacher judgment, to contribute to the teacher judgment, not to replace it. And I think one of the things that teachers appreciated is that I would always recognize that actually the standardized tests themselves do have limitations. That is true. They are a result of a test taken on a certain day by a certain student, by a certain child. And sometimes they can not be absolutely bang on, because that student might be having a really bad day that day. Maybe their rabbit died last night. You can't guarantee that test result. So for me, it was always explaining to the teachers the partnership of the test result with the teacher's knowledge and understanding of the student. That is what leads to really solid teacher assessments.
So are we saying then that the standardized assessment really needs to be part of an integrated teaching toolkit where we're utilizing the skills and experience?
Yeah, absolutely. It is one of the tools in their toolkit, and they put it together with all of the other tools in that toolkit. And that's what makes their judgments really reliable.
Well, thank you for that. Well, it brings me to my next question then, because you are a school assessment and performance data specialist, an expert in assessment management systems, and you are passionate about using data to effectively improve outcomes. Given your experience, what are the best practices that schools can use with data management for assessment?
Well, thank you. That's a very nice compliment. I take that. Thanks very much. So one of the things that I do is I'm often asked into schools to review data practices and to review data strategies. And if I go into, in fact, a primary or a secondary school, but if I think about a secondary school, often the first questions that I get are, what should we use to measure attainment in Key Stage 3, for example, or Key Stage 2? Should we use 9-to-1? Should we use mastery language? Should we use pluses or minuses? Should we use percentiles? And I know I'm a data manager, but that is not what I'm really interested in. I say to them, that doesn't really matter. You can put any name you like on your grading, on your marking, but what really matters is what goes underneath. It's that mapping of that grading or marking, whatever it is, to the curriculum. So what matters is that every single teacher in every single subject really understands how whatever grade they're putting into whatever system you're using relates to that curriculum. Now, again, shouldn't need to conform that across subjects either, because subjects are very different. So some subjects, like maths or science, might decide to base their assessments on termly tests. But some, like art or drama, for example, may choose to make criteria-based assessments in order to inform that grading. But either way, every member of staff within a department needs to be using the same method. Each department really needs to discuss their curriculum and work out how each grade can be recognised in each term throughout the key stage. So if you say that in year 5 or year 7, a student is at a certain grade what does that actually mean on the curriculum? What does that mean that they've learned? What knowledge and skills do they need to have attained that grade? Because otherwise it's just a number in a box and it doesn't really mean anything, finger in the air. It does require some curriculum mapping on the part of the teachers, which I can get resistance to because it's extra work. But once they've done it, then that can run for a long, long time, and it makes the actual grading really easy going forwards and really robust.
So it doesn't matter what kind of data system you're running. It can have all the bells and whistles. If it's not being mapped to the curriculum, then there's not going to be much point.
Yeah, 100%. Definitely.
So, I mean, I would describe that as almost like a foundational principle, right? So like a foundational principle of what you're trying to achieve. If you're running a data management system within a school, it's got to come back to the curriculum. It's got to come back to those knowledge and skills that students are learning in a way that they can then drive forward the practice and future assessment to be able to make sure that students are making progress that we'd expect them to make.
Absolutely, 100%. And I do think that when it comes to a data strategy, people do tend to get a bit tied up in knots about the terminology and about the numbers or the letters. And like, well, you know what, that comes last.
So forget the terminology, forget your 1 to 9s, just make it about what is it in the curriculum that we're trying to map this to, which can drive future progress.
Absolutely. And you mentioned systems there. The other thing that I advise on is use of different systems, because in my freelance career, I've worked with a lot of different assessment tracking systems. And I'm a member of a data managers Facebook group where there's like 4,000 data managers. And you frequently see somebody posting a question, which is, oh, which is better, X system or Y system? What do you all think? And everybody gives different answers. And I often comment and say, look, that's not the way to do it, because each of these systems out there has different strengths and weaknesses. And there will be one that will suit what your school needs and what your school is looking for, but they won't all suit. It's very much a horses for courses. And what you need to do is have a look at all of them to find the one that's going to give you the analysis and the information that you actually need in your school. And all schools are different and all systems are different. So it's a question of matching up the two.
And I find that something that's so important is making sure that whatever information goes into the system is accessible on the other side, that teachers can access and use the data in order to drive impacts in their teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of these systems can be really complex for a teacher to use. They're great for the SLT or for the data manager, but sometimes teachers can get overwhelmed by using the systems. So they do need to have, a simple button where a teacher can get the report for their class. And I always say, some people like graphs, some people like tables. Schools need to pick a system that suits what their staff are looking for, maybe one with both options, and they don't all have that. You need to make it as accessible as possible for those teachers.
Of course, make it as accessible as possible, and also have the data there so that they can run those interventions based on what the data is saying.
Absolutely, totally.
What are some of the top tips that you would have from all of your experiences?
That could take me a while, right? Well, the first one I'd say is get a really good tracking system. I'm not going to specify which one, but get one that suits your school. Make sure you've looked at all of them to make sure that what you're going to get out of it is what you need. And also that the way that data goes into it is going to be comfortable for your staff, that they're going to be happy with the way that it works. It's going to feel maybe not scary when they start to use it to put the data in. The second one is don't focus on the headlines, just focus on those individual students and make sure that they are progressing as you would want to. Make sure that the teachers have access to the data very easily. Again, online system, so they can access that from anywhere, from a tablet maybe, if they don't always have access to a computer, and that the reports on that system are really easy. Now, if the reports on the system aren't easy, start by giving them PDFs. Start by exporting, emailing them reports so they get comfortable with the reports, maybe before they have to go in and start doing filtering and things themselves. And again, send them data that's going to get their interest going. I do remember a training session that I did quite a long time ago where I thought this was going to be really quite a short session, and it ended up being really long because every time I showed them a report, and because it was on their students, they'd get all overexcited and start talking to the person next to them about, Julie Briggs and how she was doing, and what did it say about her on your subject? I kept having to stop and wait for them to finish, so as long as it's about their students, then you've got a really good basis. And then that really big one is just make sure there's a reason for the data. Make sure that it's not just data for data's sake. Make sure that it's going to have an impact on the student outcomes. Otherwise, what is the point?
That's really great advice. I really do appreciate that, Becky. Becky, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for allowing me to learn from your perspective today.
It's been a lot of fun talking to you, Ryan.
I've absolutely enjoyed it. So thank you so much, and hope to hear from you again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Lovely to talk to you.
Moving on to our lightbulb moment. The lightbulb moments allow us to share your stories, to understand the power of data. Perhaps you know already how you can get the most from your assessments, or perhaps you'll learn something new and be able to take something away from the stories shared. What was the moment you realized the power of your GL assessment data? What difference did it make to you or your learners? What did you learn? What problem did it help you to solve? This episode, we're hearing from Jessie Ricketts, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Psychology at Royal Holloway, University of London. Thanks for sharing your story.
My name is Jessie Ricketts, and I am a Professor of Psychology at Royal Holloway, which is part of the University of London. My research focuses on reading development in children and adolescents. When I work with schools around assessment, I've noticed that there can be a real light bulb moment when I talk about the distinction between proximal and distal measures of assessment. So proximal measures are really useful to them for celebrating the successes that they're having. And more distal measures are really useful for thinking about the broader impact of the work that they're doing, and also thinking about what they might need to change to have that broader impact.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Education Joining the Dots. If you'd like any more information from us, as always, please head to our training and support site, support.gl-assessment.co.uk or support.gl-education.com, depending on where you are in the world. You can tweet us using the handle @GL_assessment or @GL_education, and email us if you'd like to know more or contribute. The address is podcast@gl-assessment.co.uk. We would love to hear more of your Heard It in the Staff Room submissions. If there's a burning topic you'd like us to cover in a future episode, all you need to do is send us a WhatsApp voice note with your contribution to 07917 516 515. We'll try to include as much of these as possible. Please do follow and rate our podcast, share with your friends and colleagues, and subscribe to be notified when new episodes are available. We'll be back again in January, but in the meantime, look out for a new episode of the Renaissance Space podcast from our colleagues at Renaissance. Join us again next time, and thanks for listening.
Hello, it's GL here. We would love to hear your views on the Education Joining the Dots podcast, and we'd be very grateful if you could take a few minutes of your time to give us your feedback by following the link to our survey. You'll find this in the episode description on your device, and all feedback is welcome as it will help us to ensure that this podcast meets your needs.